Hello, everyone, and good evening. I'm your host, Jason Miles, and welcome to another episode of This is Revolution podcast. If you're new to the channel, please hit like, hit subscribe, and don't forget to hit that notifications bell as we are constantly adding new shows and cross streams to the channel constantly. Today is what I like to call Taco Meat Tuesday. I'm gonna have my shirt unbuttoned to my navel, exposing all of the taco meat. So you guys enjoy that. If you haven't checked it out yet, my co-host Pascal Robert made some appearances on some popular shows. Bad Faith with Brianna Joy Gray, and more recently, he was on with Crystal Ball and Kyle Kalinske. That being said, let me bring in the man of the Mau Mau Hour, the Pascal Robert.
Peace and greetings to the chat. Peace and greetings to the audience. Peace and greetings to Jason Miles. Taco Tuesday. I gotta think about that.
Also, I want to let people know movie night is approaching on This is Revolution, where we watch a movie and we get to have a discussion about it. And this month, I've decided I've put the Mac hand down, and we're going to watch the 1992 hip-hop classic, Fly By Night. And I want full audience participation. I will actually be pausing the movie to ask you guys questions, because this is one of the few movies that for me is so bad it's good that I'm going to have to pause it and be like, hey, what do you guys think about this scene? Does this make sense to you?
We couldn't watch something revolutionary like the Battle of Algiers. We had to watch.
We can watch. Look, there's 12 months in a year, and I decided we have to watch this movie. Infinite content. It is called Fly By Night.
You'd be surprised how many people love the crack.
Yes, you'd be surprised how many people love the crack. That is a line from one of the rap songs in Fly By Night. Someone actually said,
you'd be surprised how many people love the crack.
Yep, you'd be surprised how many people love the crack. The crack.
It's going to be triggering.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, God, yeah. I mean, I was very tempted to tweet at MC Light because she's in it and ask her what her motivation was for being in that film, because she never talks about it at all, and for good reason. But also, we are joined by the faceless voice of reason, M. Toussaint.
Contrary to popular opinion, I do have a face. Hello, the Pascal, and hello, the Jason.
M. Toussaint.
M. Toussaint, are you reading some of these comments?
Chat is always wild. I mean, they get started so early with the wildness too.
I'm trying to incite a lot of this horrible behavior by A, keeping the shirt unbuttoned to uncomfortable levels, and B,
You'd be surprised how many people love the crack.
crack exploitation.
Does crack need exploitation? Does it need 10 commandments?
Doesn't crack do exploitation?
I've never seen a movie where the guy has a rap crew, like an entourage, and the entourage literally sells drugs while he's on stage. There's a scene where the dude walks over and does a hand-to-hand to somebody in the crowd.
Yeah.
Like, their idea of what happens with rap and black people is...
That was wild.
So Band of Strays says at some point we have to watch Lean on Me for movie night. Another movie that when you go back and watch with your adult eyes, you think to yourself, man, that wasn't a good idea. Let's lock all these kids in a school in the inner city where they literally can't get out. Pascal?
I remember Lean on Me. It
Were
was
you
dramatic.
Were you in it?
No, I was not in Lean on Me.
You sure you weren't an extra from East Side High? Fairies.
Oh. Well, you know that the character that the show was based on
Yes, Joe Clark.
recently passed away.
Mr. Clark.
Joe Clark.
Mr. Darnell.
Who were we talking with that one day, Pascal? And that person that said that Joe Clark was good at kind of cleaning up the crime in that school, but didn't have an idea of what to do educationally in that school. And they needed like a new regime. Who were we talking to?
Had to be somebody from New Jersey.
I don't think it was Bertram. I'd be surprised if he even knows that.
Was it Khadijah? Had to
Was
be
it
somebody
Khadijah?
talking about education. Yeah,
Was it Khadijah?
maybe like her first appearance.
No, this was like kind of recently. Well, anyway, our guest tonight wrote a really interesting piece in Jacobin. He actually shot it to me when it came out. I'm sure he shot it to Bajlan at the same time. So as I'm looking over at Bajlan, hits me because we need to get David Griscom on the show. I was like, oh yeah, let's get. He just wrote a piece. What a perfect way to get Griscom on the show. We're also trying to do more cross streams with David and Matt. I combined his names. Let's just combine his name, and he's Mac. There's no Matt Leck. It's just Mac. Oops, got too carried away.
Right.
So we made this very interesting clip here. Where's it at? Where'd it go? Here it goes. And in it, there's a clip from an Abby Martin interview she did in 2017 after Hurricane Harvey, where they actually talk about some of the effects of oil and the effects of the oil and gas industry in Texas and the communities of the poor and working class. Is leaving our country's power needs up to the private market a key to solving the climate crisis? As David Griscom writes in his latest piece in Jacobin, quote, "It's localized boutique green power for the rich and dirty, failing public power for the rest of us," unquote. The election of Joe Biden has not ushered in green policies. In fact, the Biden administration has continued to dole out fossil fuel drilling permits. From private firefighters in the exclusive green hills of California to expensive green solutions and solar panels for homeowners in elite Texas suburbs, without basing the movement away from fossil fuels and that of labor, will we continue to see the market determine our fate? What is it going to take to make the current climate catastrophe no longer a culture war issue, but a bread and butter policy issue? We'll ask these questions and more. This is Revolution.
And you're going to get a lot of resistance, obviously, in a petrochemical, big oil town where people are working in the industry. We saw the same thing with the BP oil spill. It seems like there's so much resistance. As you mentioned, these are entrenched red states with climate denial public officials. What can be done to get environmental justice here?
We're the only entity down here in this city basically advocating for environmental justice. It's difficult, just like you said. You have an education system that STEM programs, science and math, are completely funded by oil and gas interests, where teachers get reprimanded if they talk too long about climate change, where the future of students lies in maritime programs, where they don't necessarily get advanced math or science skills. They get taught how to work a tractor or a pipe. There is no study that even has chemical exposures and their effects on public health available. You just won't see that.
She was kind of based.
She went on to say some stuff that actually the first time I watched it, she had me in tears, actually, because I mean, there's a lot of passion in what she's talking about and actually what she's doing. But without any further ado, let's bring in the man of the hour. He is the co-host of Left Reckoning. He is also a writer for Jacobin magazine, as well as Sublation. He is the David Griscom.
Honored as always to be in such great company, y'all. Happy to be here.
I do want to let you know, Brother Griscom, and I want to preface this by saying I appreciate your work. I learned a lot from your analysis. That being said, I've ordered from eBay a lot of country shirts.
Hell yeah.
Cowboy shirts, Earl Snaps. We're going to have a country shirt off for the summer of 2022.
Let's do it, man. I'm stocked. I'm ready for that.
I found this quote when I was getting ready for the show today. The newspaper headlines may shout about global warming, extinctions of living species, the devastation of rainforests, and other worldwide catastrophes, but Americans evince a striking complacency when it comes to their everyday environment and the growing calamity that it represents. That's a quote from a book that came out in '93 called The Geography of Nowhere. In your latest article for Jacobin, you use your native Texas to paint a picture of what will befall us if we continue to keep a liberal, market-based framework to fight the effects of climate catastrophe. What was the first thing that hit you when you got back home that kind of brought this to your attention?
Well, I mean, obviously, as somebody who's been on the left for a while, like I've been thinking about climate and different ways that we can win something like a Green New Deal for a good while. But for me, with this, I'll just like put my cards on the table where I think I'm like a lot of leftists and socialists where when it comes to like the secondary analysis of this stuff, you're just sort of like, I support the good policy against the bad climate policy, like not really thinking through what a transition would start to look like. And I remember being really moved by Bernie Sanders' Green New Deal in particular. Not only the boldness of the plan, but the fact that it had such a commitment to the just transition, which, you know, for people who aren't familiar, is the commitment to people who are working in the energy industry that climate policy is not going to come at your expense, that you'll be taken care of and provided for, and hopefully even better off under, you know, a Green New Deal style policy. You know, so that's sort of where I was at. But I remember I was at a big rally here in Austin and for the Green New Deal. And there's about like 600, 700 people. And it was a great turnout. We had really great speakers from labor talking about the need to unionize the solar industry and just feeling really motivated. And then AOC got up and spoke, and she did, you know, a fairly good job. But towards the end, she was sort of going off the cuff. And she started talking a lot about some of the things that she had seen in Puerto Rico about decentralized solar grids. And like what we need to be doing is decentralizing our power systems so it can be more democratic. And just from everything that I had understood, you know, going into that moment, I was like, hold up, this is not what we want to be doing. We want to be creating democratically controlled large scale utility systems like the TVA. So, you know, really the beginning of this piece, and, you know, this isn't necessarily throw a lot of shade at AOC. I think that, you know, what she's done popularizing this idea has been really important. And again, this is like an off the cuff remark, but it was sort of a realization that like, there's a lot of people here. We have a lot of energy. We want to do something. And it actually is really important to get involved in that conversation, that debate about what that actually is going to look like. Because we have seen, particularly with, you know, liberals, the Democratic Party in particular, but even look at people like Macron, a lot of the solutions to climate change, the responsibility and the burden really is looking like it's going to fall on the backs of working class people. Which is something that as a socialist, I absolutely reject. And I think that we need to be pushing back against. So that was really like what started that, you know, like really taking climate not necessarily more seriously, because it's not like I wasn't taking it seriously before, but really starting to realize that it's not so much like the slogan on the left for a long time has been like, we need to do something about climate change. But I've started to come around to the idea that like, well, it also really does matter what we do about it, and starting to investigate that and starting to look at to what that's going to mean for our future is really important. And just the last thing I'll say on this is like, you know, we need to remember that we are demanding something big, and we're right to demand it, right? Moving off of fossil fuels, but that's the system that keeps the lights on. That's the system that, you know, heats your home, that you use to cook your food. And we really do need to be thinking about what that's going to look like, instead of just sort of accepting whoever was sort of there before to decide that for us. Because, you know, particularly this fixation on market-based solutions could very well lead us into an equally, if not more difficult place in the near future.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because what really the question I have is that what does an alternative to the current climate environmental reality truly look like when we have a fossil fuel industry that is so entrenched in the political apparatus? We have states like in Texas where basically they are funding science and STEM education and are rooted in the state infrastructure. And the geopolitics of the globe is still so much tied around energy and oil production in terms of how much it roots its financial capacity in that business. What does an alternative to fossil fuels look like? And is the actual burden of getting there going to be so obscured by the status quo that it's even possible even to see beyond getting there?
Hmm. Well, I think that the first thing I'll say is like any real transition is going to have to come through labor, in my opinion. But before we get there, we can zoom out a little bit, because, you know, a lot of liberal kind of climate policy has been about, if we can just get the price right for like renewable energy, then it will work out. And we've learned that that's not really um, the case. And even with renewables, with the tax subsidies that they get, we have to deal with the reality of intermittency in the current state of renewable energy. I'm talking about wind and solar. So like right now here in Texas, you know, we've been getting threats from ERCOT, which manages the system here, that they might have to do rolling blackouts. Luckily that hasn't happened yet, but there's incredible energy demand right now because it's 107 degrees. And in this moment, for example, in West Texas in particular, where there's a lot of wind energy, we've actually see at this moment where like the heat's going up, the wind is not blowing. So that entire system of electricity production isn't working out in this moment, right? And the real cynical and unfortunate thing is that a lot of the oil and gas industry is actually really betting on intermittency as being a kind of arguments for their like permanent status as reliable and necessary systems for how we provide energy to our society. And we can't play that game. So what would a you know, a system look like? I think that system would have to be large scale TVA style, where you're really concentrating power and production. I do think that, you know, nuclear is something that desperately needs to be a part of the equation. And also a real investment in things like hydro and geothermal, where those are things that are applicable. The problem with those is that you sort of have to be blessed geographically to be able to utilize those, you know, in most places. So like that's what it looks like from a technical side. But how do we get there from where we're at right now? It has to come from a sustained labor movement, because people are realizing in Texas in particular that, you know, this system is not working. You know, all you have to do is look back to Winter Storm Uri, where, you know, over 100 people died during.
I was going to ask you about that. Were you in Texas for the winter storm?
So I was back in Texas, but I was not there that week. But I was there like 2 days after everything had sort of come through. And I mean, it was devastating. I mean, just like being there, you know, the stories that you heard from my family and people like that, you know, it was a real kind of end of days experience for folks where, you know, I talked to my mom about it, and like, She told me about how she went over to her neighbors and let them know that like she has food in the fridge, and some dry goods and things like that. And they came over, ate, and just tears rolling down their face because it was really that difficult for people when the power went out, that people weren't able to eat, people were hungry, and obviously too, a lot of people froze to death. It was a really devastating realization, I think, for a lot of people that the system that we have here doesn't work. And if I could really quick, just so people understand why the system is so bad, because one of the things that I noted in the piece that's really frustrating is that like the culture war in this country is so damn advanced that like the cultural war can like absorb any kind of moment like that. And immediately, red and blue kind of thing. So immediately after that, the big fight was wind and solar versus natural gas. And of course, Republicans are natural gas is good. The wind and solar is why we have this problem. We're doing too many Green New Deal policies. Obviously bullshit. But the Democratic side, was really trying to lionize wind and solar. It's like, well, that wasn't able to produce what we needed in that moment. The real crisis that happened was the natural gas pipelines were not weatherized, right? Which a lot of people who are, on the liberal side were noting. But why were they not weatherized? It's because we have one of the most marketized systems in the country, where it's effectively as an auction house. So it's not just one provider, it's competing providers. So the price of electricity in Texas, if you are in these deregulated areas, places like Austin and San Antonio aren't, though the entire state is on this deregulated market as a whole. There's a constant auction house. So you get to like pick who you get electricity from instead of just like the city provider. So what that ended up meaning is that so some of these pipelines froze over, but the guys who own those pipelines, they weren't stupid in the sense that they weren't like saying this could never happen. They made a financial decision that if our pipeline goes down for a couple of days, we'll lose a couple of days of revenue, and that would suck. But it's much, much less than what it would cost to make sure that the system doesn't fail, right? During those few days, it would cost.
And they weren't expecting a storm of that magnitude, right?
Well, even if they did expect it, the point is that they like the financial cost of them weatherizing their pipelines wasn't worth it to them, because what happens if your pipeline was still flowing? You made millions upon millions of dollars over the course of a couple of days. So a lot of people made a lot of money from that storm, right? So the point about the grid is like, certainly there's these technical fixes and things like that. And I don't think that we should ignore those. But what was frustrating for me is so much of the conversation was just straight up about natural gas versus wind and solar, instead of the very important note that we have an incredibly free marketized system in this state that creates these kind of crises. Because remember, for these companies, the fact that you get electricity in your home is just like a secondary effect of them making a lot of money. You get what I mean? Like they don't have any kind of like real care or moral worry about the electricity staying on. They want to make as much money as possible. So they were willing to play the game. I mean, I can't remember the provider who said it, but one of these guys said having your pipeline on during that time was like holding a lottery ticket. Like, and that's the mentality that these people have, and again, like, just to remember the stakes of this, like hundreds of people died. And that's probably a conservative estimate too. So the point is that this market fixation on one of the most important things that we do as a society, which is produce energy, creates these unnecessary crises in our system. And we need to start figuring out a way to claw back the power of private interests in the electric grid. And also on the larger question of fossil fuels, find a way to deal with an industry that has trillions of dollars invested in it. And those boys who are invested in it want to see returns on their investment. And until you can create a political movement, and most importantly, a labor movement that can challenge that power, we're not going to get very far in doing any of the kind of reforms that we want, let alone decarbonizing.
What are your thoughts on nationalizing the fossil fuel industry?
I mean, I support it in a, as a socialist. I think that for me, though, like these questions, where I'm at as a socialist these days is starting to like think about how those things would actually look and what we would need to do in the interregnum. And I think that one thing that we need to be doing in particular is really taking serious the labor commitment of things like the just transition. So I talked to a good friend of mine here who is IBEW union organizer, and I was talking to him. Unfortunately, a lot of that stuff wasn't able to get into the article, but I talked to him for about an hour and a half. It was a really insightful conversation. And I asked him about the just transition, and he supports it, I know, as a policy. But he says, when I talk to guys, they're just like, cool, I don't believe you. And also, like, why would they? Because, union workers in the energy sector from Texas to West Virginia, everywhere, have been promised a lot of things by Democrats. And they have a kind of feeling that, it's all BS. So what do we need to do? And I sort of wrote about this in the piece, was a lot of the piece was really focusing on the current state of the oil industry in Texas, and sort of showing where these kind of entry points are for a sustained labor and socialist movement in it.
And I do want to, there is a super chat on the screen for you, David, in honor of Brother Jamal. David shall be known as Brother Duad to help carry out the plan of Nation of Islam Obama.
Well, thank you very much. I accept the mission. Could I talk a little bit about the oil industry, though? Because I think that's just like,
I mean, as someone that worked in it, yeah, I spent some time in the Gulf.
Well, I'd love to hear your perspective.
It's one of more individual woe than it is of like. I actually worked in North Dakota as well.
Those are some harrowing stories.
They're mine are very different, but and where I was, it wasn't union.
Mm-hmm. And that's the rough bit about trying to unionize the sector, because I don't know what your situation was at that time, but a lot of the guys who do that kind of work, they don't always have the kind of connections. They're usually young guys, single, or maybe they have a kid, but the tenuous relationship there, and they just want to work for a bit and get out. Like they just want to make a couple years of good salary and then get out and do something else. And that makes unionizing parts of the industry like very difficult as an organizer. But like what happened in Texas, and this happened everywhere, but once the price of oil dropped during the COVID pandemic, who were the people who faced the brunt of the belt tightening? Mm-hmm. It wasn't the folks sitting in Houston, in the office, or Dallas, right? It
Same
was
thing happened in North Dakota.
Exactly. They fired all across this country. Hundreds of thousands of people were fired, around 60,000. That's probably a conservative estimate. Were let go, and mainly people who work in the oil fields directly were let go at the beginning of the pandemic. All while the oil industry was getting massive subsidies and tax breaks from the government. Just like, as I know in the piece, like one of the companies, Houston National Oil Well Varco, got a $591 million, and they fired 22% of their workforce, right?
Yeah.
And that's not even like, it was one of those things like, if you've written a piece with an editor, they cut things because it gets wordy. That wasn't even me just picking out like a striking example. He was like, it was like getting tedious because I was going through the companies and like noting how much money they got and how much of their workforce they dropped. I mean, it was egregious and it was pervasive throughout the industry. And the reason I wanted to note that is that like, this is a visceral experience that people who are working in that industry just experience. That is a bit of a preview of what might happen potentially without like a real kind of just transition labor policy if we move away from fossil fuels. So like there's that fear there, right? And a lot of times, that kind of fear turns people against green policy, which is why the just transition framework is so important, because we can make the argument to them. These guys do not care about you. They will let you go at the first chance that they get. And if we can show them a sustained capability and commitment to fighting for them, then we have a lot more allies. But that's not the situation right now.
Well, let me ask you this. Why aren't we there making that argument? As again, these are environments where Fox News is 24/7, right? Regardless of whatever people think the racial makeup looks like, it's a lot more mixed than you think in these places.
This is most of Texas too. Just
I worked with a few Texas crews that came through. Even in North Dakota, a few Texas boys came through. I had to learn how to make you people's chili.
There you go. That's the good stuff.
But in all seriousness, conservative news is definitely the dominant news. But I would say most people, they're apolitical. Maybe a few of the older people that are homeowners are a little more political, but that's not really saying much. And I think their idea of any sort of green transitions include things running independently of their labor. It's just like, well, if you get this green thing, then you won't need me. And it's like, well, you're still going to need a guy to watch gauges. I mean, you get paid $3,000 a week to watch a goddamn gauge. I'm sure you can watch it if it's green.
Or Jason, like, they know how bad jobs are in wind and solar. Like wind and solar is not a good industry to work in right now. They pay very low, high rates of injury. I don't know the difference between that and the oil industry. I would imagine the oil industry might be a bit worse, but people know that it's not a good job, and certainly you're not getting paid for the risk, compared to what you're getting in an oil industry. And again, like just put it on the table, and you know this better than me. This is not to lionize the oil industry as some kind of mecca of employment either. I don't want people to make that mistake either. But there are people who have been able to pull in decent amounts of income, and even if it's ideological, a lot of people, particularly in Texas, especially working class people, see that as a potential ticket out of low wage work.
Hell
So
yeah.
it holds a mystique for people. And again, these are people who work in the industry and they know what it's like in the other kind of green industry. So those industries certainly need to change to be more attractive on the first bit. But the second aspect of this is these are also people who have skills that will be extremely necessary in any kind of a transition, in any kind of new system. And that's why we should be encouraging more labor leadership in the transition. And, just saying again, my friend Ryan Pollock, who I interviewed in the piece, he's a organizer here in Texas. He got the Texas AFL-CIO to endorse, they didn't call it Green New Deal because people are very inoculated against that phrase, but federal environmental policy, which effectively was a mirror of the Green New Deal when it comes down to the things that they were endorsing. So, and to do that, of course, Texas AFL-CIO, you're getting people who are in the energy industry. So there is support for the policy. But again, it's just like you have to turn these things from ideas on a sheet of paper that's being passed around into an actual into an actual commitment and possibility for folks. And this other bit that I think is really important to understanding the oil industry as like an industry is looking at the current like increase in gas prices in this country. So Abbott and all these freaks are saying, oh, Biden is doing Green New Deal policy, which again is bullshit. Biden has given out over 900 new drilling permits in the Permian Basin just in March alone. He was beating Trump in his first year of his presidency for approving new drilling permits across public lands, etc. Right? Like Biden is opening up more land for drilling.
Well, didn't he do that at COP? This last COP, didn't he go there and talk about opening up the oceans for drilling? Do you remember that?
No, I mean, Biden has been a gift to the oil industry, so it's not coming from overregulation. Of course, supply chain has an effect in the sense that like opening up new wells and things like that is a little bit more difficult and tedious now, but also the fact that they fired like a significant portion of their workforce just 2 years ago plays a huge role. And this is the thing that really blows my mind when you start to look at the balance sheets of these companies. What have they done with this incredible amount of profit that they've gotten over the past 6 months when the gas prices went up? They took that money and they wrote a check to their shareholders in the form of dividends. Why? Because the most important thing for this industry is making sure that finance knows that investing in oil and gas is a safe and profitable bet to make. And this is like the fundamental point here is that there is so much material wealth invested in this system. We need to create a movement on our side that has that same kind of power. Now, we don't have money, but what we do have potentially as like socialists and people who advocate for labor and workers is labor power. And if that stuff shuts down, then the entire thing doesn't work, right? And you need to be able to leverage that kind of power of organized labor if you want to be able to come at these things, because they have the money to buy politicians. Not that it costs very much to buy people like Greg Abbott and all that, but it plays a big factor, right? They have the ability to sort of hunker down through tough times and get subsidies and protections from the government, right? They have a lot of abilities, but what they don't have is necessarily control of the entire workforce. They have a lot of tools that they use to discipline them, but the potential of labor there is extremely strong, as it is in any kind of like socialist analysis here. So if we're serious about this, instead of just thinking that if we can get the right price on cheap energy, right, through renewables, that this system is just going to transition away. That's just not seemingly like is what is going to happen. we need to really take seriously the gravity of the moment and the importance of having these people on our side. And the point is as I was saying earlier, you saw what they dealt with when they were when times were bad in the industry. And also, oil and gas has now taken on a protracted struggle against union labor in the industry. So in Beaumont, Texas, they did a lockout for 10 months. 10 months people were shut out of the workplace. And this was an attempt to decertify the union there. And they had a decertification vote that the union, the USW, barely won. Like, I'm talking a handful of votes. And they had to accept a very bad contract at the end of that lockout, right? The point is that there's a hell of a lot more that the Biden administration could be doing. The Biden administration could say to ExxonMobil, we're not going to give you any federal contracts if you're going to be locking out your workers. We're not going to give you federal contracts if you continue to do this kind of stuff. But to make, Sleepy Joe and those kind of people do anything, it's going to take serious, political movement and organization. And this is why the frustration that I have as a left as a whole, there's a lot of groups that are trying to do this work, but it hasn't broken into the mainstream yet, need to start showing up for people in these fights that are just so visceral and real, and they understand them, but they are feeling like they're fighting them by themselves.
Do you think
this
that
is
we
the
have
transition we need? Yeah.
Do you think that we have a left that's seriously interested in engaging in the organizing to get these kind of results?
I don't think we have it right now, but I think that there's movements that are hopefully pointing to it. In my little way, I'm trying to push people to do it. I think, for example, some of the most exciting thing that the DSA has put forward recently has been their rank and file strategy, where they're encouraging people who are looking for job or looking for work, instead of just working the same industries that they've been working in, getting jobs in union facilities and in union movements, to really move from like a class focused organization, the DSA being like, so we care about class, to a class rooted organization, meaning like there's actual roots within the class as a whole. But no, I mean, that's the pessimistic side, is that it's not here yet. And I'm trying to sound the alarm a little bit that like this is the work that is going to be necessary to do, because we can't show up. Then we couldn't even, like, let's just hypothetical for a second. Bernie Sanders wins 2024. Somehow we get a bunch of, lefties in Congress, big what if, right? Do we have a movement that has the capability to do the stuff on the work on the side of working in labor, to sort of push these contradictions to the forefront, to be able to make do on threats to these organizations? We don't have that kind of organization right now. So this is exactly the time that we need to be doing it, instead of waiting maybe for some, like, I mean, how disappointing would it be, right, if like everything went right in that direction, but we completely neglected this like crucial part of the strategy, which is having the working class and particularly the labor movement on our side. I think like beyond everything, and like I'd like to throw to y'all to hear y'all's thoughts on it, but like beyond everything, it's just like there's like a snobbery that comes from a lot of like PMC activists towards workers in this industry. These people know how to do things. They know how to power society, and they should be the ones who are writing up the policy. I'm happy when I see stuff coming from people from a certain kind of class or cultural basis that are pro them, but it really does need to be coming from within them if we're serious about making it happen. And the only way to start winning people and bringing them into our movement is showing up for them right now.
Mm-hmm.
I think you're making. Listen, we've talked about this on the show more than ad nauseum about why are we not organizing people in the working class spaces in which they exist to set up the politics that we need for the agenda that we want, instead of just simply depending on people who are already elected office officials trying to carry us on their back as if they are going to save us. Because from our vantage point, left politics starts in the grassroots and then is taken into the halls of government. It doesn't start the other way around.
I mean, I did a whole video essay on this idea that politicians are like heroes. There's a reason why people love Marvel movies, right? AOC isn't going to save you from yourself. Neither is Bernie Sanders, right?
Are you sure?
Yeah. You can save you from yourself, not alone.
All right, fine.
I mean, what happens when these people get into office? Like, really happens.
No, I think the example you got to look at is Syriza in Greece,
Ooh.
right? Where, and
You've been
I know Pascal's got feelings on this because as somebody who's been around in the left movement, I mean that was like the great hope for a little bit when they first came into power. But I've been very convinced by the arguments of Leo Panich and Sam Gindin on that history, where so much is made. Just to give people the briefest of briefest, recaps on that. Radical left wing coalition comes into power in Greece against the European Union and all of these horrible draconian institutions that were trying to squeeze that country. Comes into power with a massive mandate. The Troika, the European Union, the ECB, try to force them to take another austerity pill, a country that's already been impoverished. And Syriza takes it to the public and say, do you want us to accept this or not? And the people overwhelmingly say, no more austerity. We will not accept it. And Tsipras, the PM, ends up saying, well, look, they said this, but we're going to take it anyway. And it was a huge deflating moment, absolutely horrific. And then, the path that follows afterwards with Syriza is just a complete travesty. But the point that Panich and Gindin makes, I think, is really astute. And I think is the kind of lessons that we need to be learning on. Of course, we can be personally mad at Tsipras. We could say, oh, if only he had bigger balls or backbone or something like that, he could have done something different. But the fact of the matter is that what would have come with saying no would have been economic warfare on a country that had already been the recipient of horrible, horrible austerity and cuts to their way of life for years, right? To prepare the population for something like that, you needed to have much, much more buy-in and organization to withstand that kind of warfare, right? And it wasn't there. Again, like we can say whatever about Tsipras, but the fact of the matter is it wasn't there, that possibility. And I bring this point up in the same way that I talk about Bernie Sanders, just like it wasn't there in 2016 with Bernie Sanders either, nor was it in 2020, and it's not there right now. So the point is, when we are in defeat, when we are in a position of weakness and trying to grow, this is the kind of thing that we need to be preparing our movement for, is preparing to take on these big forces. And I don't think that a lot of people on the left, despite having like very good positions on things, have really thought through what state power actually would look like, because it would be a hell of a lot of struggle.
I'm with you, because I think, I don't remember who said this recently. Maybe it was Pascal even. But if you think about, someone wrote about the Powell memo, and if you think about the Powell memo and that idea that, all right, this is our line in the sand, this is our battle cry, and this is our war that we're going to fight, this 50+ year counter-revolution against all of these policies, these social goods policies we want to be against, and then we'll eventually privatize everything. There were some defeats in there for the right? But it was incremental. And look at where we are now. Now they're getting all the checks on the wish list. You want Roe overturned? That was sacrosanct for so long. Now it's gone.
It was settled, and now we live in unsettled times.
Right? But the idea that when you say, well, Jean Bajlan once said, and I agree with him, he goes, a little social democracy in the U.S. would go a long way, because we don't have it. But when you say that there's some people that want to fight about it, the idea of it, and we're not saying incrementalism is the one and only way, but it's also foolish to think that you're going to overthrow the system in an election cycle, in a year, with hope. It almost seems childlike to a certain degree, because it always boils down to, well, where's the hero that's going to save us from this? If it's not Bernie Sanders, then where is our Alex Jones type figure that's going to save us from this? It's frustrating, because historically, we often talk about the populist era. We talk about people like A. Philip Randolph before the March on Washington, like the sleeping car porters. These are not administrations that are friendly to the idea of Negroes having rights. Martin Luther King wasn't waiting for the right senator or telling
Mhm.
people to vote for the right DA, right? Before he decided to let's do this bus boycott, but we got to make sure the mayor is a lefty.
Yeah. No, yeah.
None of that shit matter. Even the debt collective. And I keep going back to this. The first time Pascal and I interviewed someone, I think together, was we interviewed Hannah Appel of the debt collective, and she didn't know who the fuck was in office when they were fighting for these young people to get reimbursed from that Corinthians University, which they ended up getting their money back from that school. And that was when what's her name was the head of education, Betsy DeVos.
Yeah.
So
You're so right.
people can move mountains if we want to move mountains, but it's almost like we don't want to move mountains. We want to keep playing the same game.
Well, I think on the question of climate change politics too, I think a lot of that has to do with where a lot of climate policy and climate politics came out of. It wasn't coming out of that kind of sustained, even like, labor tradition. It was like primarily like a lot of activists, and now is this becoming such a reality and something that's felt by people. We're sort of scrambling for solutions, and that means that the groundwork hasn't been done. I regret actually that I didn't bring this up earlier on the question of like Texas, and I think this is national too. Is that one of the other aspects of the climate policy that we need energy to be affordable for people. Right now, like in Texas and Austin, where I'm living, people have seen their energy bills go up something like 60-70% in the last year alone. Right. And we're talking large amounts of money. That's tough, especially when people are getting more and more squeezed. So there's like a popular aspect to taking a real sustained approach to building up these kind of systems. We certainly have the kind of national emergency that we did in the original Green New Deal. In the original New Deal when the TVA was created. Like, there are ways to make these things just popular on a national level, and I would love for it to be an entryway into socialist politics in general. But like, there is just a kind of bread and butter issue aspect to this kind of policy that I think that can sort of go across, cut across like ideology, frankly. And it has something that has the potential of just being extremely popular. On the Republican side, we know why they don't do it. It's because they're bought out. I mean, when Greg Abbott basically didn't do any reforms to the electrical grid after the winter storm, he got $11 million like overnight.
Wow.
And that's not the entirety of the amount of money that he's received. That was what he received like a week after, So of course we know why those guys do it. The Democrats, it's because they are so beholden to capitalism and particularly neoliberalism that, again, they think the solution is they treat the climate change crisis as if it's a problem of prices. And if we fix the price, things will fix themselves. And that's disastrous too. Because what we're seeing right now is, as you noted in the intro piece, is like there has been an increase in residential solar in Texas, primarily on rich households. And I'm not against residential solar, but I think that it's not necessarily practical to fit every home and every space in the country with solar panels when we can just be producing electricity green and clean and plentiful for the masses and pushing the price down through that mechanism, and ideally providing electricity for free, if not at like a very, very reduced cost to the public, right? Like, this is something that I think reclaiming the idea of public power as a public good is so necessary. And I just don't see a very significant downside to that as the sense of like public policy and it being popular with everyday people here. But the Democrats are too beholden to one, neoliberalism, and two, and a very frightening thing is like a very growing and powerful green industry. One thing that I think I highly suggest people, if they haven't, read Matt Huber's new book, Climate Change is Class War. He writes a lot with Fred Stafford, who is somebody who every time he writes something you should read. But in their piece in defense of the TVA, you can read in Jacobin, they make this point that's really important, that as part of like 2000s climate policy, there are preventions on the government from competing with private green producers, right? Which is permanently putting these things, competing with them with our own green energy. permanently putting the system in the hands of private capitalists, the same people who created this dysfunctional system that we're living in right now, right? So like, there's a lot of arguments that can be made, a lot of things that can be popular, but we have to, like, it's not going to come from the Democrats, because even if they get their way, is what I'm trying to say, like their policy towards this kind of thing is very, very dystopian as well.
Well, if we're going to acknowledge that about the Democrats, then what does that say about the fictitious strategy of the progressives or leftists trying to work within the stratagem of the Democratic Party?
Well, I mean, I think we can jump into this as like a whole conversation sometime in the future. I'm not running away from it right now. I'll just say this, that like, at least from my perspective, the whole point, for example, of running DSA candidates on the Democratic Party line is just the realization that we have two corporations that control ballot access in this country, but that doesn't mean you're standing with them. And I think that one of the tensions that we have right now is that we have national figures who are sort of standing in and around the DSA, but they're not like cadre members really embedded in that movement. And that certainly needs to change. I think that it has to be, antagonistic to that project, because I think, talking about some of the other dystopian futures, I mean, what would be, would be just an absolute nightmare is if like all this energy that came out of the Bernie movement, Occupy, etc., went to try to resuscitate the Democratic Party at large. That's a disaster. We need to be building up our own power. I don't have any spiritual problems, is all I'm saying, with running as a Democrat, if that's what you have to do to win elections. But I totally agree that it has to be antagonistic and make this point that the Democrats don't really have a plan for the future, certainly when you're looking at climate policy right now.
Do you think that the possibility of us trying to create third-party movements is something that we should consider?
I think that to do that, we have to develop the capacity of a movement that's able to stand on its own 2 feet going into it, if that makes sense, right? Like in the same way of like the populist party in this country, the People's Party, and remember that party ended because they made a pact with the Democratic Party to sort of absorb themselves within it. But remember, before the People's Party and the Populist Party didn't just launch and then the people came to them. That came out of the Farmers Alliance. It came out of the Knights of Labor. It came out of all these organizations. It came out of like the people, like of some form of organized working class. And I think that if we're going to do any kind of historical comparisons, like we are much more in the pre-People's Party, Populist Party moment where we're trying to construct a place where we're all at and working together and thinking. And like, that's a precondition to being able to create a political party that would be able to stand on its own 2 feet, in my opinion.
Well, I mean, I appreciate that optimism. I think we're not even at that point. I think we're still at a point where we're trying to figure out who we actually are in terms of our political ideology. But I know I'm not opposed to your argument that we're trying to work out these contradictions and come to a point of political clarity. And I think that needs to be done. But I think that all of that can be done if we are working on organizing people in their particular spaces where they are and talk about hashing this out as part of the process.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is part of the political education process that we need to do.
I mean, I think that's the moment that we're in right now and I think that political education is like a huge part of the calculation too. I think that that's one thing that has been, other than I like Bernie. I was all in 2016, 2020. But one thing that I think has been so disappointing was that Bernie Sanders never directed that movement anywhere other than like our revolution, which is just like,
Jason, how many times have I said that?
I mean, Adolf came on here and said it. I interviewed Mike Davis. He said it. Yeah. He said that was the big letdown he had. I think everybody feels that everybody old school feels very let down by that. I feel like the Bernie movement birthed something else, but we can talk about that in the next hour.
Yeah. I just want to I'm trying to think if there's anything that I think is really urgent that I want to direct your listeners to in that piece. I think we covered most of it.
I think you were rapid fire. You were rapid fire in this show. I mean, I live in Baja California, where our water, where the region I'm in, comes from the same place where Southern California gets their water. And since I'm in the shadow of Empire, my water gets shut off randomly.
Yeah.
And
almost trying to fight against that, an American corporate funded think tanks are running hit pieces against him.
it's, I don't know. Well, I've heard stories about, I call it mainland Mexico. Everybody here calls it the South. But I've heard stories of there's certain places where people have a time that they can get water, and you don't really understand how important it is to have running water until the shit gets shut off. Like, this ain't a camping trip, man. This is my life.
Well, what's the line? Kurt Hackbarth, who's another writer people should be listening to. We have him on Left Reckoning a lot. Wrote a great piece in Jacobin. It's like, it's not drought, it's plunder. And I don't know the translation to that in Spanish, but like the water crisis there is not because there's a drought. It's because Coca-Cola and the company that makes Corona, I can't remember the name of the beer companies down there, but that owns all of them. But like, they're export. It's like literally like a 1-to-1 of like what happened with the Irish potato famine, where like they were producing enough food to survive, but they were exporting food to the London markets. There's enough water in Mexico. It's actually one of the richest countries in the world when it comes to natural water resources, but it's all coming into the United States, into global markets. Right. And it's like, that's capitalism for you. Yeah.
Same thing with a lot of the produce here. It's frustrating. Again, I don't think people really understand climate change. Like, there's things that you're told to do here. Like, hey, if you really want to water something, put some buckets around you when you take a shower, and there's your water for other stuff. It was kind of shocking to get that kick in the testicles, because you're not really ready for it. But I still can't afford the United States. I mean, when I go across the imaginary line, your people's gas prices, give me irritates my bowels.
It's very scary stuff, man.
Tucson, do you have any parting words?
This was an awesome chat, an awesome talk. David, you really held court. Here for it. I suspect you're not really in the mountains, but that's okay.
I know I need to get something. I need to get something better than Yosemite. I don't know. I got it during the pandemic because I didn't want to clean my room.
The honesty is appreciated.
Yeah.
I'm not mad. I'm not mad at that.
I think this is a super important topic. There's been a lot of tension between labor and environmentalism. A lot of education needs to be had on both sides. This is good. We need
once environmentalism, people stopped looking at it as cats with hemp pants and no job. Then I think you can see a real pivot. But I think the people that work, someone made a comment about people that turn wrenches. You see environmentalists as kind of ideological, silly people that don't have their feet firmly planted in the real world. Working in North Dakota actually was one of the more interesting places, because I did come across a few people that actually were very well educated within the environment movement, but there's a lot to be said about, well, I was unemployed for the last couple of years. Because I was there after 2008. I was there in 2010, 2011. So a lot of people had lost everything. And one thing we have to remember on the left is that a lot of people are still reeling from 2008.
Oh, yeah.
That shit ain't over for a lot. A lot of people lost homes. Maybe they're not homeless, but they're no longer homeowners. And there is a lust to get back to 2004. A lot of people just want to get back to 2004, whatever that looks like for them.
Yeah, I mean, this is like the big threat that I think, like, from like the environmental movement, not to throw a wrench as we're wrapping up, you see it very, very clearly in these things like the degrowth movement, that sort of are very willing to take austerity politics, as the solution and the roadmap for dealing with climate change, and that is just never going to be popular. And I think people are right to reject that kind of policy when it's not like that's the only option, but that is the option that the state is most likely to make. You see all of the ways that the government wants to deal with climate change is on the back end. So we're going to increase the gas, the gas tax. Well, what does that do in a country that has no public transportation,
Mhm.
where most people have to drive even longer because the rents in this country are completely out of control to get to work? That doesn't stop people from driving. That just means that working people have to pay more out of their pocket to do it. And it's not going to be surprising that you're going to see backlash to that kind of thing. When instead of taking your, focusing your scope per se, metaphorically, of course, on the oil executives, they want to focus on consumers, and that is the dominant plank of a lot of people in the kind of liberal environmental movement, and certainly in the Democratic Party. And we're finally seeing a breakthrough and a change. It's not enough. But I want to support the people who are doing that. If I could do a quick shout out, like a good organization here in Texas, it's the Texas Climate Jobs Project, which is an offshoot of the AFL-CIO, which is trying to advocate for the just transition and these kind of policies that make it so we can decarbonize our economy without making the costs go on everyday working people, because people aren't going to want to vote for that, and I think, frankly, are right to reject that kind of stuff when the folks who made money are going to be let off scot-free, right? I noted it in the piece when it comes to environmental cleanup. In Texas, the profits from the oil industry are privatized, the costs are socialized. And if that's how we're going to be doing environmental policy, as just the exact same kind of formula as what got us into this mess, we're really, really looking at a bleak situation, which, again, it doesn't have to be.
Well, on that note, I want to shout out a few things. As people have noted on the show, they get to hear M. Toussaint, never see, because she's a woman, right? We went over this, right? But these are jokes, people. No one. We also have another new addition to the crew, and that is Quinn. Quinn has been producing a lot of the social media content, which I don't know about you, David, but all I want to do on social media is fuck with people like you and Waz about sports and retweet pictures of toys from my past. That's all I want to do. And now Quinn has been handling a lot of the Instagram and Twitter duties, and it has left me free to just stay away from the goddamn internet. And Quinn went so far as to say, he said, "Hey, can I create an outro for you guys?" I was like, I don't give a shit. And he created a new outro for us. So thank you, Quinn. We'll have to bring you on so people can hear your lovely voice as well. We actually met in New York. M. Toussaint, you met Quinn, right?
I did. Cool guy.
Did we all take a picture together?
No, I'm not in any.
That's why? That was strategic on my part. I'm keeping you the biggest mystery ever.
That's good for everyone.
You are our little chocolate secret. So please enjoy the new outro video that we'll probably be using more on Saturdays. And we will see you guys in the champagne room. Also, if you are a patron of Left Reckoning, I'm going to send the link to David so David can send it out to y'all. So the Left Reckoning patrons can watch the show too. And we can have a good old champagne jam, as they say in the redder, necker parts of the woods. Peace.